The hospital room was too white, too still, the kind of place where even the ticking of the clock sounded like an accusation. The man on the bed looked smaller than he ever had in life, tubes running into his arms, machines measuring the beats of a heart that had once ruled over two women with careless arrogance. For the first time he was silent, powerless, lying with his mouth slack and his eyes half shut. The doctors had explained it clearly. The stroke had left him suspended between worlds, and his fate depended not on his will but on the signatures and voices of those closest to him. His wife stood near the window, hands clasped so tightly they seemed carved from stone. She had been with him for decades, through the gray days of hard work, through the humiliations she endured when whispers followed her at church picnics, through the quiet nights when she had chosen silence over confrontation. She was a black woman who had built a life on patience, on dignity, on the belief that storms passed if you stood firm enough. Yet here she was, staring at the husk of a man who had betrayed her trust in ways too deep to count, and wondering whether patience had been a blessing or a curse. The door creaked and the air changed. She turned, expecting perhaps a nurse, but instead there entered a woman younger, her heels tapping with hesitation, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. The mistress. The interloper she had never met but had always felt in the corners of her home, in the smell of cologne that lingered too long, in the sudden absences and the excuses that piled up like lies in a child's mouth. The wife froze, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to split into two currents, one of rage, the other of grim recognition. She knew her without needing words. The younger woman looked at the bed, then at the wife, and her lips trembled before she spoke, though the words barely made it past her throat. "I had to come." That was all, nothing more, and silence fell heavy again. The wife did not answer. She didn't need to. The truth was plain. The man they both had known in different ways had pulled them together into this cold room, and now they were tethered not by love but by his ruin. A nurse entered briefly, adjusted a drip, then looked at both women with a kind of neutral pity that carried no judgment. The nurse left and the door shut softly. Alone again, the women stood on either side of the bed, unwilling to move closer to each other, unwilling to admit the strange bond that circumstance had forced upon them. The wife remembered nights when she had cooked dinners he never came home to eat. She remembered the careful way she had folded his shirts, even when she smelled the faint perfume on them that was not hers. She remembered the way she had convinced herself that holding on was better than letting go, that appearances mattered more than truth. She had told herself that age brought calm, that in the end he would settle, that she had earned his loyalty with years of sacrifice. And now she saw the evidence of her illusions lying helpless, mouth twisted, body no longer the master of itself. The mistress, standing at the foot of the bed, had her own memories flooding in. Promises whispered in motel rooms, dreams painted in secret meetings, the thrill of being chosen even if only in shadows. She had believed him when he said he would leave his wife, that he only stayed for respectability, for family reputation, for convenience. She had waited, convinced her patience would be rewarded. Now she saw him too, not as the man who had promised her escape, but as the husk who might never speak again. And she realized with a painful clarity that she had never been more than a mirror for his vanity, a younger body to make him feel alive. Neither woman spoke, but their silence was louder than any accusation. The wife's eyes hardened, while the mistress's shoulders sagged. Two women who should have hated each other found themselves caught in the same net, each realizing the cruel truth. They had both been used, both deceived, both left with pieces of a man who had thought himself clever enough to live two lives without consequence. A doctor came in, clipboard in hand, voice firm but cautious. He explained what they already knew. Decisions had to be made, discussions about life support, about dignity, about how long machines should keep fighting when the body was giving up. He asked who held legal authority, but in the awkward pause it was clear that neither woman was ready to answer, because both felt they had earned a claim. The wife through vows spoken long ago, through years of sacrifice. The mistress through devotion that, though hidden, had consumed her prime years. The doctor left them with papers and a warning that time would not wait. When the door closed, the tension thickened, and both women's eyes turned to the man on the bed. His chest rose and fell shallowly, his presence barely more than a shadow. It was then, in that unbearable stillness, that the wife understood something terrifying. She no longer felt only rage at the other woman. What she felt was recognition, a bitter kind of sisterhood forged in betrayal. The mistress, sensing it too, looked up, and for a fleeting second their gazes locked. Neither smiled, neither softened, but something passed between them, an understanding that they stood not as enemies but as two sides of the same broken coin. Outside the window, the city went on, cars moved, lives continued, but in that room time held its breath. The man who had controlled everything now controlled nothing. His fate no longer belonged to him. And though neither woman spoke it aloud, the question lingered heavy in the sterile air. What should they do with the power they now shared? The silence of the hospital room followed them even when they stepped into the hallway. Neither woman had spoken after the doctor left them with the weight of the decision, but something unspoken bound them to the same orbit. They moved as if tethered, unwilling to part, unwilling to face the truth alone. The wife walked slowly, her shoes echoing on the tile, and the mistress followed a few paces behind, uncertain whether she belonged there or not. The corridors smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee, the peculiar fragrance of places where lives teeter between continuance and collapse. The wife stopped at a row of chairs and sat down heavily, her body carrying decades of wear, her hands trembling slightly though she tried to still them. She did not look at the younger woman at first, but memories pressed forward, demanding to be acknowledged. She thought of the years when she had been a young bride, the hope in her chest so wide it had seemed unbreakable. She remembered the long hours she had worked to keep their household afloat when money was scarce, remembered saving coins in a jar so their children could go to school, remembered listening to his plans that never came true. And most of all she remembered the countless nights she had swallowed her hurt, her pride, her suspicion. She had clung to her vows with the tenacity of someone who believed that loyalty would one day be repaid. The mistress shifted uneasily, lowering herself into a chair 2 seats away. For her, the past unfolded differently but no less painfully. She had not entered the affair seeking to destroy, she had been drawn by his confidence, his charm, the way he spoke as if he were the only man who could see her dreams. He had convinced her that their love was genuine, that patience would bring its reward, that she would one day walk beside him in daylight rather than shadows. She had waited through birthdays missed, holidays spent alone, and lonely mornings when she checked her phone for messages that came late, if at all. She told herself that sacrifices would matter, that love meant endurance. And now she sat in the harsh light of the hospital, realizing she had given her youth to a mirage. For a long time neither woman spoke. Their silence was not empty but full of all the words they could have hurled at each other. The wife could have shouted about betrayal, humiliation, about the years she spent covering his tracks so their children would never suspect. The mistress could have demanded acknowledgement, could have claimed she had been loved too, could have said she was not merely a thief but a believer in his false promises. But instead they sat, the truth pressing down heavier than anger. The wife's mind wandered to Sundays at church, where she had smiled with dignity while whispers rustled behind her. People had known, of course. In small communities nothing stayed hidden, yet no one said anything to her face. She had felt their pity like a bruise she could not cover. Still, she had chosen silence, had chosen to hold her head high and endure. But endurance had cost her. It had etched lines into her face, hardened her body into a vessel of patience. Looking at the mistress, she saw not only the woman who had shared her husband's bed but also the reflection of her own mistakes. The choice to stay, the refusal to demand more. The mistress, for her part, thought of the nights she had waited by the phone. She remembered the thrill of stolen hours, yes, but also the emptiness that followed when he went home. She remembered dressing carefully for him, believing his words when he said she was the only one who kept him alive, believing she mattered more than his past. She had built her life around him, yet she had never been introduced to his family, never been invited to his home, never been given more than promises. She saw now that her devotion had not been a sign of love's strength but of its blindness. When the wife finally spoke, her voice was low, almost weary. "You thought he'd leave me?" It was not a question but a statement, and it carried no malice, only tired certainty. The younger woman lowered her eyes and nodded faintly. No denial, no protest. Only a shared understanding of what he had done to them both. The wife leaned back in her chair, the fluorescent lights above carving shadows into her cheekbones. She realized something startling. She did not hate this younger woman. Not anymore. Hatred required energy, and she felt only the drain of years wasted, trust squandered, dignity eroded. Her anger belonged not to the mistress but to the man who now lay silent, who had orchestrated this cruel theater. The mistress sensed the shift, though no words were spoken. She folded her hands in her lap and allowed herself, for the first time, to feel anger not at the wife but at him. It was a sharp, clean anger, burning away the delusion she had carried. She thought of how he had smiled when he told her to be patient, how he had kissed her and sworn that everything would change, and how she had believed. Now she saw those memories for what they were, tools he had used to bind her, just as he had used vows to bind his wife. The hallway grew quieter as visiting hours waned. A television flickered in the waiting area, muted voices filling the air with meaningless chatter. Yet for these two women time seemed suspended. They sat together, divided by history but united by betrayal, and the question loomed larger. What did justice look like now? Was it mercy, allowing the machines to keep him tethered to life, or was it release, letting him go to face whatever judgment awaited beyond? Neither answer felt simple. As the wife looked at the papers the doctor had left, her hand hovered but did not move. The mistress watched, her own heart racing, as if the pen in that moment could erase or confirm years of pain. Neither of them reached for it. Not yet. The decision was too great, and they both knew it could not be made without reckoning with the past more fully. The wife closed her eyes and the mistress turned away, both aware that the choice would define not only his fate but their own. The air hummed with unfinished sentences and questions unasked. The man in the hospital bed was not the only one caught between life and death. Both women in their own way stood suspended too, waiting for the next moment to force them forward. The next morning the hospital felt colder, though perhaps it was only the weight of anticipation pressing down on both women. They had spent the night in uncomfortable chairs, each drifting in and out of shallow sleep, their minds circling the same unresolved decision. Nurses moved briskly through the corridors, machines beeped in distant rooms, and the smell of disinfectant clung to every surface. The wife sat upright, her hands folded in her lap, her back refusing to bend under the exhaustion. The mistress leaned forward with her elbows on her knees, hair falling loose, the fatigue of a long night written plainly across her face. The doctors returned with updates that offered no comfort. His condition had not improved, nor had it drastically declined. He existed in limbo, neither fully gone nor truly present, a body sustained by machines while his will remained silent. They spoke of options again. Surgery that might prolong life without promise of recovery, continued life support, or the choice to withdraw. It was the same conversation as yesterday but heavier now, because each repetition made the decision harder to avoid. When the doctors left, the women finally broke their fragile silence. The wife spoke first, her voice low, cracked with fatigue but laced with years of stored bitterness. He promised me we would grow old together, and I clung to that promise while he was giving himself away to you. She did not raise her voice, she did not need to. The truth in her words carried its own sting. The mistress responded quietly, almost shamefully. He told me he loved me more than anything, that you were only a habit he couldn't break. Her eyes flickered toward the bed, and she realized with sharp clarity how those words now sounded, hollow, manipulative, almost absurd when measured against the sight of his failing body. The tension broke like glass, each confession slicing into the silence. The wife felt the anger surge but then falter, because she heard in the mistress's tone not triumph but regret. She realized that while she had been deceived publicly, the mistress had been deceived privately, fed promises that would never be fulfilled. Both had lived lives warped by his selfishness. As hours dragged on, fragments of his double life began surfacing in small details. The wife recalled discovering unexplained expenses and late-night phone calls that had kept her awake in silent torment. The mistress remembered the stories he told her about business trips that had been nothing more than excuses to slip away for a few days of escape. Side by side, their recollections painted a portrait of a man skilled at division, who thrived on secrecy, who believed himself untouchable. By mid-afternoon the women were no longer enemies locked in suspicion but reluctant witnesses piecing together the truth. Every memory they shared revealed another layer of betrayal, another reminder that neither of them had ever truly possessed him. Their lives had been parallel illusions, their sacrifices devoured by the same man. It might have seemed that this revelation would bring them closure, that recognizing the depth of his deception would allow them to part ways, each content to leave the other behind. For a moment it even felt that way. The wife gathered her purse, preparing to leave the hospital for the first time since his collapse, while the mistress stood at the window, staring at the city as though seeing it clearly for the first time. The air felt lighter, as though a decision had silently been made, that each would return to her own life, that they would let the doctors handle what remained, that the burden no longer needed to rest on their shoulders. But when the wife reached the door she hesitated. She turned back to look at him, pale and still under the sterile lights, and something stopped her from leaving. She realized that walking away meant allowing the story to remain unfinished, meant surrendering the last word to the man who had already written so many chapters without their consent. She could not let him have that power, not now, not after everything. The mistress, sensing the same pull, did not move either. She had imagined storming out of the hospital, cutting ties forever, but the sight of him chained to life by wires and tubes anchored her feet. She too realized that this ending was incomplete, that without their decision, he remained in control even in his silence. And for the first time, both women understood they were bound together not only by betrayal but by responsibility. The mistaken resolution dissolved like mist. They were not finished. Their confrontation had only just begun. The rest of the day passed with few words, but the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing hour. Nurses came and went, machines hummed, but the women barely noticed. They sat together, each lost in thought, both aware that the next choice would shape the rest of their lives. As evening descended, the city lights flickered outside the window, casting a faint glow into the sterile room. The wife leaned forward and studied the lines of his face, so familiar yet so foreign in this state of helplessness. She saw not the man she had married but the architect of her disappointments. The mistress studied him too, but where she once saw passion and escape, she now saw manipulation and selfishness. Between them lay not just a dying man but the ruins of their illusions. The decision still lingered unmade, heavy as a stone neither could lift alone. Yet they knew that soon they would have to. And when they did, it would not be as rivals but as reluctant allies, wielding the strange and terrifying power his downfall had placed in their hands. The next day dawned gray, the kind of morning that blurred hours into one long stretch of waiting. The hospital cafeteria smelled of burnt toast and bitter coffee, yet both women found themselves there, seated at the same table though neither had invited the other. They ate little, their trays barely touched, the silence between them no longer filled with hostility but with an uneasy recognition. The mistress stirred her coffee absently, eyes lowered, while the wife sat upright, shoulders squared, as if discipline alone could keep her upright through the storm. By now they both knew what the doctors would say. Nothing had changed. He lingered, caught in that twilight state, neither worsening nor improving. The medical reports repeated the same phrases, the same cautious prognosis, and yet each time the words carved deeper into their minds. The decision could no longer be delayed forever. As they returned to the room, something shifted. The wife paused by the bed and studied him closely. His skin was pale, his breath shallow, his once powerful frame shrunken. For decades she had known him as the man who controlled every conversation, who entered a room with authority, who silenced doubts with the sheer force of his voice. Now he lay before her, reduced to a body dependent on machines, and she felt a wave of clarity wash over her. He no longer held the power. It rested in her hands, and in the hands of the woman standing across from her. The mistress stood at the foot of the bed, clutching the railing as though it anchored her. She had imagined this man as her savior, the one who would deliver her from loneliness, the one who promised her a life worth waiting for. But now, confronted with his fragility, she saw him not as a hero but as a thief who had stolen years from both of them. She realized he had never intended to give her the life she dreamed of. He had fed her illusions while keeping her hidden, using her as he used his wife, each in different ways. It was then that the wife broke the silence, her voice steady but stripped of any softness. "We have a choice to make and we cannot keep running from it." She did not look at the younger woman, but the words hung in the air like an unspoken pact. The mistress nodded slowly. She felt the truth in those words, felt the inevitability pressing down on them both. "Yes," she whispered, though it sounded more like an admission than an agreement. They stood there, the beeping of the monitors filling the void. For the first time since their encounter began, their eyes met without hostility. There was no forgiveness but there was understanding. Each saw in the other not just a rival but a fellow prisoner, someone who had suffered under the same hand, even if in different ways. The day stretched on with small interruptions, the nurse changing fluids, the doctor updating charts, but the central fact remained. Two women who should have despised each other now shared an unspoken alliance, bound by betrayal and the strange responsibility of deciding how a man's story would end. By afternoon they began to talk, not about him but about themselves. The wife spoke of her children, now grown and distant, some living in other states, their own families absorbing their attention. She admitted she had stayed in the marriage as much for stability as for loyalty, convincing herself that endurance was noble. The mistress listened quietly, her own guilt heavy, then confessed her wasted years waiting for promises that never materialized, the birthdays spent alone, the shame of being introduced to no one. They shared stories like reluctant confessions, each exposing wounds that had festered in silence for too long. As they spoke, something shifted again. The hospital room no longer felt like a battlefield but like a courtroom where they were both witnesses testifying against the same man. Every memory they shared became another piece of evidence, proving beyond doubt that he had deceived them both, that he had used their devotion to serve himself. The wife finally admitted aloud what she had known deep down for years. He never loved either of us the way we deserved. The words landed heavy, but the mistress did not argue. She simply nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. It was the first time she had allowed herself to accept that truth. Night fell, and the two women remained in the room together, no longer avoiding each other's presence. They sat in silence, sometimes glancing at him, sometimes at each other, the air thick with anticipation of the decision they still had to make. Yet beneath the tension there was a growing sense of resolve. They were no longer two women fighting over a man. They were two women deciding what to do with the power he had never intended them to share. When the doctor returned and asked again about their decision, both women exchanged a glance. It was brief, wordless, but it carried weight. They were not ready to speak the final answer, not yet, but something in their eyes told the doctor that they were moving closer. He left them alone again, trusting they would come when the time was right. Later, as the hospital quieted and the hallways emptied, the wife stood by the bed and placed her hand gently on the railing. She looked at him for a long time, then turned to the mistress. "We will decide together," she said firmly. It was not a suggestion but a declaration. The mistress stepped closer, her hand gripping the opposite side of the railing. She met the wife's eyes, and though no warmth passed between them, there was recognition. They would not let him dictate the ending. They would claim it themselves. In that moment the strange alliance was sealed, silent but undeniable. And though the question of what they would ultimately choose remained unanswered, one thing was certain. The man on the bed would not be the one to decide. His power had ended and theirs had just begun. The final morning arrived heavy with expectation. Neither woman had slept much, but both carried a new clarity, as if the long hours of silence and confession had stripped away every layer of denial. The hospital room, once suffocating with resentment, now felt like a stage awaiting its last act. The man on the bed remained unchanged, his chest rising and falling with mechanical rhythm, his life reduced to numbers flashing on screens. The wife stood near the window, her back straight, her hands clasped behind her. She looked out at the city waking up, commuters rushing to jobs, children being shepherded to school, life pulsing forward without pause. For years she had built her world around a man who now could not even lift his own hand, and she realized with startling simplicity that her life did not need to remain tethered to him. She had survived betrayal, endured humiliation, raised children into adulthood. She was more than the sum of his choices. The realization felt like a door opening, though stepping through it frightened her. The mistress sat by the bed, her eyes fixed on the pale face that had once seemed powerful. She studied him without the haze of longing, seeing not the man who whispered promises but the man who had used her loneliness as fuel for his vanity. She thought of all the hours wasted, the birthdays missed, the hollow future she had built around him. She realized she had been waiting not for love but for freedom, and now, in the cruelest of ways, that freedom was within reach. When the doctor entered, he spoke with the calm authority of one who had delivered these words many times. The chances of recovery, he explained, were nearly non-existent. The body could be sustained but the mind was gone. To continue would mean endless dependence, machines keeping rhythm in place of will. The question was no longer if they should decide but when. He asked if they were ready. For a moment neither woman moved. The air was thick with the weight of finality. Then the wife turned from the window and walked toward the bed. She placed her hand on the railing, steadying herself, her voice quiet but unwavering. "We will decide together." The mistress nodded, her throat tightening, but she gave no protest. They stood on either side of him, the two women he had bound with lies now united by truth. The monitors beeped steadily, oblivious to the storm of human emotion raging around them. The wife thought of the vows she had once spoken, the years she had lived by them, the sacrifices she had made. She had honored her promise long after he had broken his. The mistress thought of the dreams she had clung to, the illusions that had kept her waiting. She had given him her youth, her loyalty, her patience, only to find herself with nothing in return. The decision came not as a sudden impulse but as a quiet understanding that passed between them like a current. There was no dramatic gesture, no raised voices, only the shared recognition that prolonging his life meant prolonging their own chains. Letting him go was not cruelty but release. Release for him and release for them. The doctor returned with forms, his pen poised. The wife and mistress exchanged one last glance. In that silent exchange was all the acknowledgement they needed. They signed together, the ink sealing not just his fate but their own liberation. The machines were silenced one by one, their hum fading until only the shallow sound of his natural breath remained. Minutes passed, slow and inexorable, until even that ceased. The room fell into a silence deeper than any they had known. Neither woman wept. The grief they carried was not for him but for themselves, for the years they had lost, for the illusions that had bound them. Yet beneath the sorrow was something unexpected, a sense of peace. For the first time they were not prisoners of his choices. For the first time they had chosen for themselves. The wife stepped back from the bed, her body trembling slightly but her gaze steady. She felt older than her years yet strangely lighter, as though she had shed a burden she had carried too long. The mistress remained seated for a while longer, staring at the stillness of the man who had once consumed her world. Eventually she stood, her legs unsteady, but she too felt a new strength stirring within her. As they left the room together, neither spoke. They did not walk as friends, but neither did they walk as enemies. They walked as women who had faced the same storm and emerged not unscarred but unbroken. Outside, the world moved on, cars honked, birds scattered, children laughed in the distance. Life had no intention of pausing for their grief. The wife inhaled deeply, tasting the sharp bite of morning air, and realized she could still build something of her own, even in these later years. The mistress tilted her face toward the sky, feeling the sun warm her skin, and realized she too could begin again, no longer waiting for someone else to give her life meaning. Behind them, the hospital swallowed the memory of the man who had once believed he could control two lives at once. In the end he had lost that power, and the women he thought he owned had claimed it for themselves. The finality of their choice lingered, but so did the lesson. Betrayal could bind, but truth could liberate. And sometimes, justice did not come from courts or revenge but from the quiet, united decision of those who refused to be victims any longer. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.